Buenas
Hello
tardes.
and welcome to this first afternoon of the Charles V Award Doctoral Seminar Grants. We had a very fruitful morning, very rich in content, where panelists told us about solidarity from a conceptual, historical, and practical perspective. So now we are going to elaborate in that principle of solidarity. The first presentation will be moderated by Professor Eric BUSSIÈRE. He is a member of the Monnet chair. He has been a professor in Paris, in La Sorbonne, and right now he's a retired professor. He's a member of several scientific councils in Europe and in France, and he's a director and participant of many scientific collections, member of the Histoire magazine, and his work is on European construction, and he just directed 3 volumes on this topic. The last edition was in 2019, and he's the co-director of the work on of Ortolian Barroso, and Barroso was one of the persons who received the Charles V Award. Professor BUSSIÈRE has been with us for 20 years since we started this adventure of doctoral seminars. He's one of the fathers of this program, so we want to thank him his presence for him and for us. It's always great to see how this program evolves thanks to people like him and thanks to some other people who haven't been able to be here. This initiative started a long time ago, and many young people have been part of this process. And right now, many of these students are in very prominent situations. Some of the students are replacing him in the um, in his work. So they have gone from students to professors. Professor Bussière, it's an honor to have you here. And please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So it's a pleasure for me to introduce the third session with a paper more about a more concrete and specific field of European solidarity. And I have to tell, I appreciate a lot this paper. I will explain why in a few minutes. Two characteristics. First, it's an optimistic paper. It's not so frequent. Optimistic and realistic, but optimistic. And also, it's about economy and finance, but it's written in very clear language, and everybody can understand the purpose. So it's a quality in this specific field. And we understand why, because Pablo Alonso Rodriguez had a course from about 10 years, 7 or 8 years, about, he was first student in a business school, so he has an interest for financial subjects, banking especially, and also is preparing a thesis in law and economics. And perhaps at the beginning of his paper, his presentation, he can tell us what are the links between the papers, his presentation today, and the subject of his thesis. I think it's interesting for everybody to know that. So, you have to.
First of all, I want to thank you for your kind words, Professor BUSSIÈRE, and I want to thank the foundation. Without the foundation, none of us would be here, obviously. And since this is the second part of the first day, I am starting to feel how this doctoral seminar is going to enrich all of us, those who are sitting on one side of the table. And I hope that we will also be able to enrich the members of the jury and all the members of the foundation. My topic has evolved, obviously, since the original proposal that I made. Who would have told us that when Antonio Tajani received this award, things would have changed so dramatically? I tried to adapt my initial proposal to the reality, to this current situation that we're experiencing, and to the progress or the progress or the evolution of the actions to face the COVID-19 pandemic. Sadly enough, although it seemed that we were getting out of that situation, it seems like there's a road ahead of us before we can say that it's finished. Firstly, the structure of my presentation is going to follow the paper. However, I have the wonderful opportunity of presenting my work after very rich sessions that already delved into the concept of solidarity, so I'm not going to describe that concept in depth. And that way I will have more time to talk more about some other sections of my paper. There's a second point, which is a brief reflection on European programs in response to COVID-19. And then my second part of my presentation will assess the road until the current situation, and there's a clear presence of the European Union in financial markets, which is absolutely innovative, as we will see. And I will wrap up my presentation with some reflections that hopefully will fuel the debate. As I was saying, I'm not going to talk in much depth about this first section because we have already covered these aspects in the first sessions in the morning. I just want to highlight, to give a little bit of context on my presentation, that as we have seen, the principle of solidarity is not single. It's plural. It has two sides, as we have seen in the morning. It's both a value and it's included in the treaties as an objective. And in this sense, I wanted to mention a recent judgment of the Court of Justice, where both the defense and the prosecution mentioned and echoed this concept and principle of solidarity. In this sense, the general lawyer, in his proposal or orientation, highlights this specific case. It's a case that included France and Poland, and and it was connected to energy solidarity in the gas market. And the reflections of the lawyer and of the tribunal, the general advocate and the tribunal, can be extrapolated to the European Union in general. In this sense, as I was saying, the court echoes in its ruling of the position of the general advocate that is fully shared.
Well, he says very clearly, unlike different judgments or previous judgments of the same tribunal, that the principle of solidarity has a practical reflection. It is not just theoretical, but real. And that justifies many of the policies of the European Union. This is, of course, not new. And I would like to mention something that has already been mentioned by the president of the trusteeship of the foundation. It also comes from a foundation in 2002, that broad configuration of this principle. And finally, it reflects something that has been already mentioned in the morning sessions, the Schuman Declaration and the variants of solidarity. Well, if we think about what the European Union has done since the pandemic started, in the morning someone said that the initial response of the authorities was subject to the shared responsibility in the European Union. They hesitated at the beginning of the pandemic in their response, but the European Union at that time extended the existing policies and programs to try and cover, of course, not their initial purpose, but to cover the pandemic, sanitary crisis that was coming over. At that time, the European institutions were not aware of the magnitude, the dimension of the pandemic, but of course, the European institutions wanted to act as quickly as possible, and they tried to make the member states agree together. And as we saw this morning, they nonetheless took very different decisions, from severe lockdown to closing of borders. But, well, the European Union, what it did was to try and extend the existing programs. But I would try to speak as much as possible about the two most recent projects, the SURE program and the Next Generation EU program. Regarding the first one, the SURE project, I think it is a success in every single aspect, because the European Union in April 2020 submitted the proposal, and a month later it was already adopted, and a few months later the funds were already arriving to the countries that applied for them. So, when in this case the European Commission was talking about distributing the funds as quickly as possible, indeed they did it as quickly as possible. So out of the 100,000 million euros, 94,000 million euros have already been distributed, allocated to the member states. So not all of the member states applied for these funds, but most of them did. And According to the European Commission, this program has helped more than 20 million European citizens and has prevented the destruction of 1.5 million jobs in the European Union. The Next Generation EU funds is the second example, and it is a dramatic change in the traditional economic policy of the European Union. Since it was a major shift, it took longer to debate them and to distribute them, so little time, several months elapsed from the first draft to from the first proposal to the final allocation, even though it was very quick, I must say. What are the Next Generation funds? They are an abundant, big amount of funds available to the European Union member states. And there is a novelty about them too, because traditionally the European Union, when it distributed funds among the European Union members, applied some conditionality rules, meaning the money needed to be returned after some time. What is this program about? It has two axes, the first being the recovery and resilience mechanism that holds 90% of the funds, and the remaining 10% takes care of the assistance programs, because of course they cannot replace the existing programs. They needed improvement in order to cover the challenges caused by the pandemic, not only in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of different challenges, economic challenges and social challenges. As some were pointing out, the fundamental or the major contribution of this program has been that it tried to remediate the impact caused by the pandemic, and something else. The European Union proposed, and that was later accepted by the Parliament and the Commission, proposed not to forget the von der Leyen, the proposal by von der Leyen to extend or to extend the programs that were foreseen, that were being under preparation when the pandemic started. So this is in line with two strategies of von der Leyen's presidency: the green transition, the Green Deal, and the digitalization of the European Union. That's why most of the funds will be devoted to these two aspects. As I was saying, the main revolution of this mechanism is that there are loans and subsidies. And the subsidies will be allocated as quickly as possible. So 70% of the subsidies will be distributed in 2021 and 2022, and the remaining 30% in 2023. After much debate, as you can remember, little more than a year ago, the distribution has not been 50% loans and subsidies, but something quite similar, something quite close to those two percentages. It is more or less balanced between loans and subsidies. where do the institutions want to focus upon? As I was saying, they wanted to alleviate, to relieve the effects of the pandemic on the short term, without forgetting the goals highlighted by the President von der Leyen, and by reinforcing the social cohesion, territorial cohesion, and to some extent, they will focus on preparing us for future crises, because if we learn from previous crises, we'll be better prepared for the future ones. And we can see two elements in what I have just explained, in how to allocate the funds, how to distribute the funds. The rules are quite complicated, but I have tried to group them in two groups. On the one hand, there is one of the criteria to grant the funds is to have been impacted much by the pandemic. So the states that have been very much impacted by the pandemic will be a better candidate for the funds. But at the same time, the funds also take into account whether the member state have the possibility to get out of the crisis by themselves. Because in some other cases, there are countries that even if they have been impacted less by the pandemic, they don't have the mechanisms to recover quickly from those lesser impacts. So there is another criterion to get the funds. Because otherwise the cohesion policies that have tried to erase the differences between the member states would be useless. For example, if you take the case of Romania and France, they had both similar impacts in their economies, but the funds received by Romania and France differ. But obviously, the European Union does not give subsidies or funds for free without anything in return. So what will be the distribution of these funds? Only 13% of those funds are already available for the member states. The remainder will be distributed, provided that the member states can justify how they used the first funds. And they have to even go beyond. They have to take into account that the European Union does not want to change the policies that were foreseen, that were under preparation before the pandemic. So the European Union has issued a series of recommendations, and they want the member states to implement those recommendations in their recovery plans. So that's how we expect the funds to be distributed. And as I was saying, there are two types of funds. Subsidies on the one hand. The subsidies need not be returned, but the execution of those funds will be monitored. And the second group of funds is under the form of loans that need to be returned, but but only after a long time. We know that the member states are interested in receiving the funds, but we still don't know how much money they will have to return to give to to repay. So there is a lot of uncertainty. There is uncertainty too because in order to get the funds, they need to fulfill certain criteria, several criteria that have not been exposed as of now. The second part of my paper will focus on the actions that have been taken so far, the generation of the funds, meaning how to fund, how to finance all this. And for that, we need to look back and analyze how the monetary and the financial and monetary union was created. The monetary pillar was defended by Germany, and the economic pillar was defended by France. We cannot forget, France said we cannot forget the economic aspects. And that's why I'm talking about an asymmetric configuration criticized by the doctrines. But the monetary pillar was privileged over the economic one. This was reinforced by the Stability and Growth Pact, in which the German thesis was privileged over the French one. This asymmetric setting led to some tension within the period when the economy grew, improved. They were not very visible, but when the recession came in 2008 and 2009, the asymmetries were clearly visible. And this led, a few years later, in the sovereign debt crisis. And then the institutions in Europe needed to react again, but they reacted from a very clumsy point of view. They did it very clumsily and very late because they created temporary economic assistance plans for basically Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. Those mechanisms included severe conditionality rules, the famous troika that you have heard about. It is, of course, something that are still in the minds of the beneficiary countries. So this was very imperfect, but then in order to complement those funds, a new facilitating mechanism was created. But would it not be for an institution that had a central role? We would still be immersed in the sovereign debt crisis, or even maybe the economic and monetary union would have some cracks now. I'm talking about the European Central Bank, of course, and its decisive role. And I would like to quote his president, Mario Draghi, when in a press conference in London, he said those famous words: "During my term, I will do everything that it is necessary and becomes necessary to preserve and stabilize the Eurozone. And believe me, that will be enough." So he was standing in front of the market and said, "I am making this project possible. I am making this possible." And obviously, the European Central Bank went from words to deeds and launched a massive debt procurement program. But this path is a very long one, as I was saying, because when the euro was being devised and was reaching our pockets, there was already a working group in the European Commission, the Giovannini Group, that defended an idea that has survived, the creation of the eurobonds. In 2005, in the context of the implementation of the Lisbon Agenda, the former President Barroso said that it was necessary for the European Union to transform itself, and for that we need to implement the decisions that have been taken. But sadly, we needed funds for that. This is quite recurring. The community budget is always lacking the funds that it needs to do everything they want to do. And now I'm going to mention a proposal for the creation of eurobonds, meaning looking for funds to support something that was deemed necessary at the time. That is basically the same thing that exists now with the Next Generation EU. So it seems that this time there were funds for this program. There was the possibility to raise the funds that were necessary to support the policy. The European Parliament, which is always very active in this kind of matters, commissioned a report in the year 2000 and then issued a specific proposal, a specific application for the European Commission to develop it in 2011, and that action was very active. One of the proposals that are still resonating nowadays is the one that I'm quoting here, the blue-red bonds, that basically means splitting the debt of the member states in two levels based on the criteria set in Maastricht. You know that the ideal for a member state to have debt of a maximum of 60% of the GDP. So the member states said, okay, this is reasonable. We have all agreed that 60% is the maximum amount or the maximum percentage, and everything that goes beyond 60% is not our problem. If a member state goes beyond 60% of the GDP, then it's their sole responsibility, not the European Union's responsibility. There were other proposals, for example, the one by the group Euronomics that proposed for the creation of secure and safe European assets. This is an idea that then gave way to other different proposals. But in line with the situation that was the situation of 2011, you remember the sovereign debt crisis that affected several member states. The periphery of Europe compared to the center of the Eurozone, one of the member states located at the center, at the core of the Eurozone, launched a proposal. They said, let's create a mechanism that will get us out from this situation that we're living. The European Pact for the Debt Redemption. It was a temporary mechanism. It was not a structural one. That very same year, other authors said, no, we need to create a European debt, and for that we need to agree on things that can be repaid in a few months' time. So let's issue some debt, short-term debt, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year maximum repayment terms. And that's how our situation will be better. And the European Parliament invited the Commission again to develop those ideas into a proposal. And for that, they identified 4 potential steps, as you can see on the screen. Sadly, after 2013, the only thing we have received from the Commission is a proposal in 2018, a proposal to create the foundation to pacify the doctrine debate in case a new crisis emerges. Will it affect the weakest members of the Eurozone? Will it affect the banks? Because, of course, normally banks of a certain country buy the debt that has been issued by that same country, and that's it. That was it. That was the rules of the game before the pandemic that have changed totally or partially the approach suggested by the European institutions. As I was saying, there is a growing presence of the European Union in the financial markets, as you can see in this diagram. The European Union has not started issuing debt to the markets recently. They've done it for decades, but in very small programs only, with a very clear approach. The European Union lent money or borrowed money from the markets in order to distribute it among the member states that had specific problems and needed money. Well, the SURE program is the end of it, because it also solves a specific program, unemployment, or a specific problem, unemployment, but with a different approach. The main difference, the main novelty of the SURE program is the social bonds. They have used it very smartly. They say, if we are to support the national plans for unemployment, let's issue bonds linked to the problem of unemployment and the subsequent policies, because it's justified. And all the funds of the SURE program have been used so far. And it's also very well regarded by the markets. In the first meeting in October 2020, there was the biggest application for allocation of funds, bonds, by member states.
But as I was saying before, in terms of capacity, in terms of the amount that is to be received from the financial market, Next Generation EU is the most important or relevant program. So the European Union needs to change its approach. It used to go to the markets just when it needed funding on a timely, on specific situations, and now there's a management of that debt. And now the EU says, I'm going to go to the markets regardless of when I need to issue the money to the states. I'm going to finance myself, and I will award the money to the states whenever it's necessary, but there is no connection between issuance and allowance. This is how a stable issuance program is created, and the EU goes a step farther, as if when the share program we were talking about social bonds, now we are talking about green bonds. The European Union didn't forget about its green program, and it's saying, I am aware that this type of bonds are rare in financial markets, but I am going to make this another way of financing in the future, and it acquires the commitment to issue at least 30% of these bonds under the form of green bonds. So this takes us to the end of my presentation, and here I would just like to briefly give a couple of ideas that may be food for thought and for the debate afterwards. I wanted to talk about the European response to the pandemic. During the first months, the response was really basic and lukewarm, but very quickly, and the Council and the Parliament and the Commission realized that this pandemic called for new ways of action in such a way that the main milestone was the launching of this program, Next Generation EU. And in my view, this is the translation of solidarity in reality. It's like what happened in the beginning with coal and steel. That those were the initial politics. Now our policies are much broader, but these policies require funding. In 2005, there was a failed attempt to do this, but now in 2021, for the first time, we have been able to fund these policies in going to financial markets with the guarantee of all the member states. But there's a caveat. When we compare this with the response against the pandemic in the US and Japan, we see that the figures here, not only in general figures, but also when we talk about the percentages with regard to the GDP, our figures are much lower than in those countries. And lastly, I want to make a final reflection. The European Union is going to issue bonds on behalf of the European Union in the next years. But this is a program due to finish in 5 years. So my doubt is as follows. Will this trigger a future joint issuance similar to this in the European realm, or will it stay here? Or will it be just the response from the Union to the pandemic? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Okay. It's better. Well, I think your paper put on the table very fundamental questions. If I listen to you, the question for you, and you are right, is how to go from a solidarity that is a collective response of a shock to the ability to anticipate by developing programs that can reinforce the EU. So it's not only the way to the ability to borrow money, it's also the ability to develop common policies and a budget. If you have a budget, if you can borrow money, and if the money you borrow and the budget can help to develop new common policies or reinforce them, then the solidarity change. I liked much two quotations of the beginning of the paper. We spoke about Schuman Declaration, so it's too much. But you spoke about Jacques Delors in 1982, if you remember. And you know probably that in the mind of Jacques Delors, the Maastricht Treaty was not very good. For Jacques Delors, the time was to transform EU to a political union. The problems were not now, in the 19th, of an economic nature, not only, but also on of a political nature. Why? Because the developing of common policies, a link between these common policies and the capacity for EU to develop a global project with all these instruments. You can consider them as pillars, but for the law, you have to consider them as a sort of a global instrument driven by political objectives. If now we look at your paper, what is very interesting is a link between your point 5 and the rest. What you show is the EMU, as it was conceived, was unable to respond to major shocks. And I think at the end of your paper, you put on the table a good question. The COVID crisis is probably not finished. So the solution we have now probably have to be transformed and evaluated with new policies, etc., etc. I want to come back to the beginning of the EMU for people that perhaps don't know everything, but that you can develop after. But the EMU, as it was developed, was, as you tell us, asymmetric. So the problem for us is to correct this asymmetry by developing the ability to develop new economic and also other policies. So the two shocks you mentioned show that the EMU conception of 2000 was not the good, and they show that it was able progressively to respond to the shock by some transformation. And this transformation and the limits and the perspective, I prefer the perspective of this transformation, are on the table today. So that's probably the most important impact of your paper. Two or three other points. You mentioned, and you are completely right, at the end of the 2010, it was a UCB that was able to give a response. So that means solidarity, the real solidarity, means transfer of sovereignty. If you are not an organization able to decide, you are condemned to give response on an intergovernmental way and to wait for the new crisis. That's your paper. Two or three more points. First point, you are really right when you speak about EIB, because the model of EIB is probably the model of EIB and his ability to borrow money on the market is probably the same that is now used. And also, probably you could make a reference to more ancient elements. First, the ability of CECA, for the first coal and steel community, to borrow money. In the 70s, the debate around the facility orderly. That was also the ability of European Union, European institution to borrow money. And I think for the moment I have to stop my speech because I have a lot of others. We can speak after.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much again for your kind words, Mr. de BUSSIÈRE. From my perspective, the asymmetry, the asymmetrical configuration of the European Union, I'm not going to say that it originated and caused the different financial and economical crises that we suffered in the last years or decades, but undoubtedly, as you mentioned, this asymmetry hindered a decisive response from the European Union to what we have seen. We have witnessed intergovernmental agreements that attempted a solution to this problem, but perceiving the problem as something temporary and without recognizing the deeper problem. And the deeper problem is to try to integrate things that are not similar, things that are potentially cannot be integrated, and this leads to imbalances that may erase the benefits that arise from a strong single currency like the euro. That is, at that time, in the 90s, we lost a great opportunity to compete on equal basis with other economies that we always mention. We always talk about the United States and Japan. We created a currency that could potentially be strong in international markets, but we didn't really create a real joint policy. And this led to tensions. Anytime there are problems in the international financial markets, there are tensions. And this has a very strong impact, not only on the economic front, but also in the political realm, as you pointed out. Undoubtedly, many of those who criticize the integrative European phenomenon focus on the thesis that argues that the European Union doesn't want to go beyond. And when we talk about the European Union, we're talking about the member states that compose it. So these member states don't want to go beyond the economic integration purpose, and always making some social concessions. But what they criticize is that there is no political willingness. That political will that the founding fathers had, and that some others in the 20th century had when they talked about the need to become integrated as Europeans. In such a way that it is very relevant, however, to not isolate the tax aspects. In this case, that's what we're talking about right now. It's that to not isolate that from the rest of the integration matters, because in my opinion, they are interrelated. In order to progress, we need, and this was mentioned this morning, we need Europe citizens putting pressure on the different institutions to achieve this progress. There will always be opposed interests in the different member states, or in the different governments, better said, of the different states. But if citizens really share values as it is established in the treaties, those values need to be put into practice. And how can they be put into practice? Well, with the development of policies And to this end, we obviously need more Europe, but to have more Europe, we need to be faithful to the um, voice of citizens. If citizens perceive that what institutions are doing don't benefit them or even affect them negatively, as I said about the Troika, maybe if they feel this way, when they have to support something on a European level, they're going to say, well, beware, because maybe the path to more Europe doesn't benefit me. I will never forget the demonstrations of retired people in the Syntagma Square in Athens because of the European policies. These retired people saw how their purchasing power plummeted, and they had problems to survive. And I think that was a terrible example of how not to use the solidarity principle. This has an impact, and things like that really leave an imprint in societies and groups.
I agree with your remarks because, you take an intergovernmental position, you see what it is, and you say it's difficult. No. The reality is European Union was able to react more and more rapidly and with some efficacy. And the ability of leaders of European Union was to use the opportunity of shocks to build a response. So you have not to ask people if they want to be solidarity. You have to use shocks to demonstrate the present situation is not good and not viable, and to build new policy. You have not to build an entire political schema. You have to develop some points and to progress in that sense.
Desde luego, quizá...
Maybe I didn't express myself correctly, or maybe I addressed the topic from a different perspective. That is that responses have been developed to crisis, but these responses are partial. From the sovereign debt crisis, we came out with a bank union that had initially 3 pillars and that currently only has 2 pillars. I hope that we will come out of this crisis with something, but if we are not able to address the underlying problem, and this is where I disagree with you, if we are not able to have a European, we don't have European policies that are at the same level as monetary policies on the economic front, we will always have recurring problems. Obviously, we have to make the most of the crisis to close those gaps, to bridge those gaps, or to solve those problems, but we can also make the most of those crisis to find a final solution and not to just find patches that solve the problem temporarily, but I'm not going to deny that those patches can set the foundations for future developments. But I want to go back to my initial thesis, and I believe that we must think whether we really want to become integrated politically, because if this is the case, even if it's complicated in the long term, it would be easier to say, well, these constructions or these developments that we need not only economically, but also in other realms that are also interesting for European citizens, and we need to do this. And I think that as citizens we have an important role, not only in times of crisis, because in the last years we have looked at Europe, because maybe there will be other crises where we stop looking at Europe, and we will decide, well, the European project is not useful anymore, let's change it. To avoid this, I think we need to build Europe not only one crisis at a time, but also step by step. Congratulations, Pablo, for your work, for your presentation. There are many topics here that I'm interested in. I have been taking notes, and I have taken notes of everything that was analyzed by Professor BUSSIÈRE. There's something that you mentioned in the beginning. We never thought we would have a situation like this, and the situation made the European Union react. I think the European Union reacted as a political model of integration. With this, I'm not saying that the model is perfect, but I do believe that the European Union made it clear that only through political deepening can it give a response to facts like the arrival of COVID-19. When you said in your presentation that the European Commission and the European Council started reacting, I want to emphasize something. There is something that I already said this morning. The European Parliament, with its power, a power that was strengthened by the Lisbon Treaty and that needs to be strengthened further, was able to set the path through the speeches of our representatives. That is, what we do with our votes. It was able to set the path to set a roadmap for the European Commission, and for the European Commission to be able to make all those sovereignties agree. And sometimes these sovereignties can be selfish, but they were able to agree. And why do I say this? Because when you said that it's necessary for European citizens to raise our voices, I believe that in this representative democracy, our voices are included. But I do agree totally that through the conference on the future of Europe, that is not yielding the fruits that we expected, because we have a digital multilingual platform, because of how it is designed, because of how topics are addressed. But it is our task and our goal to raise our voice on fundamental aspects that are connected to the foundation of the European Union, and that call for political and economical responses like the recovery funds themselves. And why am I saying this? Well, because we are in a situation where if we do not suggest the changing of the treaties, for example, changing from unanimity to majority, if we don't point to changes like this, it's going to be very difficult for us to make interesting achievements. Something that you have mentioned in your presentation, to turn this joint and several debt of the European Union that has been issued for the first time, and that is an action and a milestone that is revolutionary in the European Union, to turn this into a pattern, to turn it into an action that is connected to a political action that involves more European integration. I think we are at a very important moment, and if we allow populism, nationalism, and everything that goes against the European Union, if we allow those, we are going to not achieve more integration and connectivity. And there is something that should be clearly emphasized in your work, which is the milestone, which is the multi-yearly financial planning 2005-2007, and that is Next Generation EU, and how these connect to the safeguard and the respect and the direct connection with the respect of the rule of law. And this is a milestone because this harmonizes and connects economy, that is the tangible, and that great leap, and for this to turn into something that is contingent to that is intrinsic, to the European Union, and this is connected to the rule of law, without which our political integration is not possible. And my last point is that I found one of your quotes very interesting. That idea to make European everything that is reasonable, to make it European. There was this very European thing to recover the sovereign funds. And when it comes to eurobonds, to assemble and to have these green bonds to create a perfect agreement, and the fact that Europe will be the first carbon neutral continent by 2030, and this path of the euro bonds, in my opinion, sheds light on the political will of the EU in connection to Schumann's quote when he was talking about coal and steel, and he talked about step by step, and he said that your European Union would be built step by step based on specific policies, based on de facto solidarity. So eurobonds and green bonds, more specifically, are, in my view, an evidence of a practical Europe that aims at sustainability, and Europe that believes in an environmental sustainability, but also that believes in sustainability in terms of policy, economy, and, of course, in everything related to the institutions. I think this is a work or a task that has many connected aspects, and the great question is, how many more topics will there be that can be made European in a reasonable way, but also in a brave way, with a political will and aspects that may follow this path set by the bonds. And there's another aspect, and that is whether these next EU funds may be the seed of a common tax European policy that would benefit, without any doubt, and would involve more integration and a deepening of our policies. And that is what we want for our European Union.
Another question, response globally. That's for me. Okay.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you for your work. That was very clear and very well structured, very self-explanatory, and it has explained the evolution of this new era. But there is something that launched a debate here. The control of the allocation of funds. You've talked as France and Italy as models because they had commissions composed of relevant experts. I guess the same goes for Germany, independent experts. that somehow have to allocate the funds. So my question to you is whether you think or not that it should be interesting to address that issue too, because it is not just about setting up the fund, which is a revolution, I agree with you, but also about guaranteeing the accountability mechanism, because the money that is being allocated has been paid by all the taxpayers, even if some of the money comes from the markets. But I think it would be interesting to add that, so that the citizens can rest assured that those funds are well administered, well organized, fairly shared and distributed, and very well controlled. So I think you should add something about it in your paper, because the rest is very well designed.
Sí, muchas gracias, Pablo.
Thank you, Pablo, because I think your exposition was quite clear. It's been a good roadmap, very well structured. Thank you for your clarity. I am not an economist, I am a historian. And in my opinion, as a historian, I am concerned to see the construction of the European Union pillars in an integrated way. Well, each one of us is a specialist in a different topic, so we put emphasis on our topic, of course. And Teresa cares about the citizens. So that's why she asks about the safety mechanisms for the citizens to know that the funds have been equally distributed. And my question is how the notion of the construction of Europe is explained to the citizens. The construction of Europe, one of the visions of the citizens is very negative, because it's about the Troika, the interventionism by Brussels. Or another vision could be another point of view would be the one of the distribution mechanisms, because what is at stake is the construction of Europe. And that's why the construction of Europe needs citizens, but the citizens know that the construction of Europe cannot be done just with values, but also with funds, with money. So I would like you to explain your negative vision, the Troika, and the positive vision, the funds.
Muchas gracias por las preguntas.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I will take the last question first. So yes, in fact, I was talking about the citizens in my presentation. It is true that in the proposal, when I sent the draft, I didn't include it in the draft because it was going to be too long. But of course, I think I need to include the need to link the funding capacity of the European Union with the response to the needs of the European citizens. The European budget is always scarce, and it should be linked to something specific, to specific proposals, to say to the citizens, when we have gone beyond the budget, this is what we have reached, this is what we have achieved. For example, yes, the Troika is something negative, but the vaccines are positive, because at the beginning of the of the health crisis in Italy, the beginning of the 2020, we all thought that the situation would be limited to Italy, but then when it all reached us, then we joined our efforts to buy medical supplies in the market, and we saw the planes being loaded with masks bound for a specific member state, and then another member state offered to pay twice as much, and then the plane was detoured and sent to that other member state. So that's when we started to think about maybe joint strategies. At the same time, we started to question the policy to dismantle our industry and have everything made in other markets. And the same debate emerged when the member states started to talk about their vaccines, and they put their flag when they organized the press conference to talk about vaccines. But at the same time, there was an emergence of a wave to get vaccines together. And, well, I think virtually all the countries in the European Union started the vaccination programs on the same date. So, yes, there are highs and lows in this health crisis. We've seen that the joint actions led by the European Union has achieved quite a few things, and the citizens know it. So maybe we should delve into that discourse, because for the citizens, the discussions held in Strasbourg or in Brussels, they perceive it as very far away discussions, very, very distant discussions, and the reality proves the opposite is true. The decisions that were made in the past have affected the citizens. In the past, those decisions were justified with political reasons or economic reasons, but now we have to reverse them. I can now answer the first questions, for example, the one by Professor Del Rio, when she talked about the political transformation that took place. We have a clear example. A policy that was not competence of the European Union, but the Parliament said, well, anyway, we need to react very quickly, and pushed the Council to act very quickly. Or another example is the liberalization of the roaming fees, the roaming rates charged by the telephonic operators that, as some say, was a mistake, was the consequence of a mistake, because in their meetings, the European Union was all the time rejecting the imposition of or the disappearance of the roaming fees. But someone leaked it to the press and said that the roaming fees had been abolished, and then they said, okay, if it has made it to the press, then we have to really suppress the roaming fees. So anyway, there are several debates going on about these issues, but it makes sense. Or does it make sense that for several European policies, they can be approved and passed with just a small difference of votes by simple majority? Or should we reform the way they pass those decisions, they approve those decisions? It is true As for the second question, it is true that, well, I'm not an expert in that topic, that mechanism, but I think it's quite scarce because several member states nowadays respect the rule of law. Some others have questioned it, and they try to attack the public policies one way or another, but for example, in the process for the approval of the national recovery plans, we've seen that the result was good, and they were approved. I've seen the tables in which I saw the member states had a qualification of B, and the European Commission decided that all the European plans were of good quality, the A quality. And they included countries that in parallel were discussing countries that some people claim they do not guarantee the rule of law. And regarding the last question, the remaining one, the Green Deal, yes, I think it's a success. And why? Because the European Commission, when it said, I have the commitment with the market to issue at least 30% of the debt in the form of green bonds, so that I'm contributing to the development of this new way of funding. This is a first step to increase this type of funding, and this is the first step also for the future fiscal green policy. As we had in 2013, there was already a roadmap, so maybe we should not reinvent it. We should retrieve what the European Parliament had already stated in 2013. The European citizens are well aware of the need to go green, and the European citizens are enthusiastic about the Green Deal. It is really interesting for the citizens. The citizens feel attracted by the Green Deal, so the European Union can really use it to press the member states to adopt more green agreements. Instead of having it just as a temporary solution, it can last. And regarding the question by Professor Freixas, the control of the allocation of funds, I think it is of the utmost importance, especially from a theoretical point of view. Because in the theoretical arena, it is a question of true communication and clear communication. For example, in Italy they said, well, we are going to use the most brilliant economists to try and handle these funds that we are receiving. Italy has applied for all the funds and all the loans in order to revolutionize the economy. We'll see whether they make it or not. But at least they said we're going to try. And some other countries have been more moderate in the application for the funds. And now I will talk about the practical aspects of this. Having a series of independent experts should guarantee a very efficient allocation of the available funds, but not necessarily. Because what you need is the companies, the enterprises, the businesses to propose how they will use those funds. and to use those funds in a sensible way, so that in order to reactivate the Italian economy in this case. So yes, we need to control the allocation of funds, but at the same time, you need good ideas on the other hand, on the other side, so that the funds are properly and sensibly used. Because you can have a good idea that was not feasible because you had not funds, and the moment you have the funds, you have the resources, the idea becomes feasible. As I was saying, only 13% of the funds were allocated as soon as the national plans were approved. But for the remainder, the member states will have to justify that the first funds they have received are being used when what they should be used. And the green transformation, digitalization, and the recommendations sent by the European Union. So that is a form of control, because the funds, the remainder of the funds, will only be released once the use of the first package of funds has been justified. The short social bonds and the green bonds are different from the normal bonds by a fundamental reason. In a normal bond, you do not need to justify what you are using the money for. You just have to justify that you're going to repay it or how you're going to repay it. But for the green bonds, you have to justify that you're going to spend the money on green instruments, ecological instruments. I wanted to say, first of all, congratulations. Your presentation was very clear and very well structured. And I also want to congratulate Marie Waschinger and Ruben Schiemann. I didn't have the chance to say it this morning. Well, we're about to close this first day of the doctoral seminar. I think when I speak on behalf of myself and the co-director, and I wanted to emphasize the very high level of your presentations, which comes as no surprise, because this is what we expected. Otherwise, I should force the members of the jury to resign. So we are happy, but we're not surprised. We are looking forward to the rest of the presentations. This morning, I was talking about the intermediate goals and the intermediate analysis of life. So this opinion I am issuing today is not my final opinion, and I hope on Friday I will be able to say the same about the rest of the presentations. But I am confident I will. But for now, our joint opinion is that we are very satisfied. Well, that is my first comment, and now I would like to comment on Pablo's exposition. I wanted to ask you two very specific questions. You've talked about financial and the tax solidarity, but I would like to talk about the inter-territory solidarity. Many of you come from big cities in Europe: Bogota, Florence, Madrid, Berlin. And you're now in a village, 1,500 people. And tomorrow, Cuacos de Yuste, you will be visiting Cuacos de Yuste, 800 inhabitants. This is Europe. This is the same Europe that you come from, the big cities. So how to practice solidarity in the cities and in the villages, how to practice the inter-regional, inter-territory solidarity, especially with the empty Europe the places that are being depopulated, how to practice solidarity in those places. That is my first question. The second question is, shall we say something about the tax balances? Because the tax balances are part of the solidarity schemes, don't you think? We have a very good expert on tax balances. She could be talking about this for ages, for hours on end. But Pablo, can you say something about it? Thank you.
Muchas gracias por las preguntas. La verdad que...
Thank you very much for those two questions. I will try to cover them in 5 minutes. Regarding the first question, inter-territory solidarity, I have two answers. Digitalization and green economy are my replies. If we talk about Extremadura, it's very clear for me. This Spanish region has very good potentials in these two aspects of life, digitalization and green economy. So now we have the money, we have the funds. Now we need projects to use those funds so that the digitalization will enable it. We've seen it during the pandemic. Many European people have come to Spain for work online. Not only the Canaries, any place in Spain, or Italy, or Europe in general, Belgium, Germany, you name the region. But for that, of course, you need a structure, a digital structure, and also a good transport network. By train, I'm not going to talk about it. I know it's a very sensitive topic, but we also need to, of course, we need to link that to the green economy. We need to connect all regions in Europe. So having additional funds, having additional money as an opportunity and a responsibility for all institutions. And as Professor Fraser said, this is important. It is important to see how those funds are being controlled and monitored, because now we have this opportunity. So the excuses that were valid when there was no money are no longer valid. So now we cannot use those excuses anymore, because otherwise the problem is no longer any of economic nature. And another important topic is, I know, a political reason. Is it a political reason or an economic reason? If it's a political reason, then we have to solve the political problems first, so that we can really allocate and apply and use the funds. The European Union did it when they extended the existing programs that fight inequality at a regional level. So if we have to choose, let's use them. Sorry, we cannot hear Juan Carlos' intervention. He was not using a microphone.